Welcome back to another video lecture from AP World History, and this one is on imperialism. So European imperialism is really important for your understanding of how the world changes after 1700. Most people, including the author of this video, see the Industrial Revolution as being the pivotal moment when the globe kind of turned upside down. After the Industrial Revolution, the predominant powers in China, India, and the Middle East are really going to lose their power relative to the European nations. But this would not have happened without the Europeans using their Industrial Revolution to take over major areas of the globe. So, how is the Industrial Revolution connected to European imperialism? First, it's important to note the difference between European exploration and European imperialism. European exploration that took place during the 1600s and 1700s was largely about sending out European settlers and exploiting the areas for natural resources like sugar, timber, cotton, and tobacco. European imperialism was about conquering areas in the Americas, Africa, and Asia in order to get both natural resources and use local labor for productivity. But then there's another issue that becomes important with these new historical processes. How do you justify these actions, if you're the Europeans, for conquering and exploiting? Especially when Europe just claimed the heritage of the Enlightenment, natural rights, democracy, local representation. This is going to be the time period when a new form of racism, known as scientific racism, is going to be used to explain and justify the new form of imperialism. So here's my thesis for this presentation. The Industrial Revolution really is directly tied to European and other forms of imperialism, since there's a need for raw resources and labor for manufacturing. This period is relatively unique in that the culture is also used as a way to exploit local people and create new forms of racial hierarchies. Okay, let's start off with the economic side of imperialism. European nations needed raw resources for mass manufacturing, especially cotton for textiles. This had been the case in European exploration as well, but with the new factory system and mass production, the need for raw resources grew to a whole new degree. Plus, Europeans needed the labor in these areas in order to get these resources and quickly transfer them back to Europe. The prime example was Britain's colonization of India for cotton and silk. The other part of the economics, or really technology of imperialism, was how the Industrial Revolution made this possible. Until the 1800s, Europeans did not have the ability to conquer large populations in Africa, the Middle East, or Asia. This changes with the new tools from the Industrial Revolution. The railroad allowed Europeans to get into the central parts of Africa. New medicines like quinine made it possible to stop or even slow down the effects of diseases like malaria. And most importantly was the new introduction of mechanized weaponry, especially the Gatling gun. This gun allowed Europeans to fire thousands of bullets in just a few seconds. The Gatling gun was a huge contraption. It sat on a pedestal that swiveled back and forth. In one battle, the Battle of Omdurman, 300 British came up against 10,000 Africans. In one afternoon, over 6,000 Africans were killed, only 30 British died, and they were mostly killed by friendly fire. The point is that mechanized weaponry made it possible for Europeans to attack large kingdoms, and the British justified this by saying that the African theater of war was an experiment, or staging ground for these weapons. So now let's look at the politics of imperialism. This last point is really important from the previous section on economics because Europeans had to justify what they were doing, given their Enlightenment heritage. Europeans ruled colonies either directly or indirectly. A direct rule was when Europeans would send their own political or military managers to a colony. France tended to do this in West Africa. Britain chose to rule through a system called indirect rule. They would do this by taking some of the middle classes of the colonies and placing them in managerial positions of power. Britain did this in places like Western Africa and India. This placed these middle-class rulers in a strange position. They wanted independence, but they were willing to wait since Britain gave them power. A good example was the Indian National Congress, a group of Indian reformers who advocated for local rule but postponed it until the unknown future. And that brings us to the ideology of imperialism. So back to that issue of justification. How does a European country that believes in natural rights, equality, and democracy justify this type of rule? Well, the way they did it was to show that people you rule over are not really human. And this gave birth to the belief of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was an adaptation of Charles Darwin's idea of evolution. Darwin had developed the idea of natural evolution, in which species competed and adapted in the natural environment. They passed down their genes to the next generation, and the only fittest group would survive into the next generation. Darwin did not really directly apply this to humans, but we do have writings from Darwin that started to make connections to the argument that some groups of humans might be naturally superior or inferior. It was later followers of Darwin, like Herbert Spencer, who argued very clearly that inequalities in the world were based upon the natural and inherent inequalities between groups. This gives birth to scientific racism. Okay, so what are the consequences of this new idea, scientific racism? Well, it was used to justify the exploitation and exclusion of numerous groups around the world. I'm just going to give you a few examples. First, King Leopold of Belgium. He acquired the Congo in Central Africa. They mined diamonds in the colony. The Belgians used the local Africans to do this. They made distinctions in this part of the world, not just the Congo, but in other places as well, like Rwanda, where they would make distinctions between African groups. For example, the Belgians claimed that some Africans shared similar traits to Europeans, like height, fair skin, and thin noses. In Rwanda, they called these people the Tutsis. They also claimed other Africans did not share these traits and called them the Hutus. They then put the Tutsis in charge. Note that the Belgians were using supposed racial features to create a managerial class. And they still considered this group inferior to the actual European Belgians. Even worse, the Belgians were known for their brutality. For the Africans who worked in the mines, their lives were dangerous and filled with horrible working conditions. When Africans complained about the conditions in the mines, the Belgians were known to make an example of some Africans. They would take them outside and literally cut their hands off in public, demanding the Africans go back into the mines. How do you justify this? Well, for the Belgians, the Africans weren't really equal and full humans. A second example happened in Australia and New Zealand. Both of these areas had been settled by the British. They used those areas to send convicts, who were supposed to get a second chance. The convicts would come to work on the land, make their own farmland. However, there were indigenous people on the land. In both cases, the European settlers who had been sent there tried to then conquer and exclude the natives. In the late 1800s, they actually passed a law called the White Australia Law that claimed the land was only for racially Caucasian individuals and groups. The irony, of course, here is that it's convicts looking for equality and local empowerment who then took it away from the indigenous population and new immigrants. Why? Because social Darwinism justified their actions as one of racial superiority. A third example happened in Asia. Japan had been isolated for centuries. Under the previous Tokugawa regime, the Japanese had resisted Chinese expansion. The Yuan dynasty from China tried to invade Japan and failed twice due to tropical storms. In 1850, the American Commodore Perry threatened Japan. He told them if they didn't open up to trade, they would be conquered. So Japan did open up. Then they went through a civil war called the Satcho Civil War between the traditionalists and the progressives. The traditionalists won, but then they dramatically changed Japan. They moved the daimyo, those local governors, into their cities. They industrialized, they created a massive navy, and they centralized rule under a new Meiji emperor. What was important was their next step. They began to use their navy to expand into places like Korea, China, and Mongolia. And they justified all of this, claiming their Asian racial superiority over other Asian groups. So note, social Darwinism has begun to spread globally and was used then by other imperial powers. So, having said that, what are our big takeaways? Here are the big three that I want you to consider for this section. Number one, imperialism is tied to industrialization. Industrialization provides the economic motive of mass production and the technology used in order to conquer people. Takeaway number two, this was all justified under this new belief system called scientific racism, in which the argument made from social Darwinism was that certain races were inferior, others superior. And number three, social Darwinism didn't just stay in Europe. It would pass over into the United States, and it would pass over into Asia as well. Okay, I'll see you in class.